In the chapter Friend, which is terribly adapted in most films, Friedrich sees that Jo is struggling to write for Weekly Volcano. The stories that she was asked to write forced her to look material that caused her depression and anxiety. One of the methods that the transcendentalists used as a way to transcend was that they would sort of scan themselves. They would look at the situation, their own doings from multiple different angles, and see if there was something that needed to be changed. Louisa did this all her life. In Little Woman, Amy, Jo, Laurie, and Friedrich, and other characters, they all have these kind of moments of clarity. When Friedrich tells Jo that the sensational stories can corrupt a person's mind, Jo agrees with him because these sensational stories have already been corrupting her mind. And this is one of the things that has never been adapted. Louisa's experience was the same as Jo's. She wrote sensational stories and then she had a moment of clarity. We could compare this to a person who is working for a company. The payment is small, they get no appreciation, and the content they are asked to produce goes against their own personal values. Friedrich helps Jo to see all that, and by doing that, she gets her self-worth back. Her writing also improves, because after this, Friedrich gives Jo a set of Shakespeare's novels, and Jo begins to search for her own literal style. The amazing thing about this is that Jo does exactly the same thing to Friedrich. Friedrich is described to be a very friendly and extrovert person, but the narrator also mentions that he feels quite isolated. He is not in a place in his life where he would like to be. He is in a job that doesn't give him many challenges or professional satisfaction. The narrator, Louisa, mentions that he dreams about falling in love and starting a family. He loves his nephews, but he is also painfully aware that it would be difficult to find a person who is ready to accept the boys as well to their life. Louisa May Alcott also points out that Friedrich has experienced discrimination for being German, and this makes it difficult for him to find a job. The best adaptation that shows this is the Little Woman musical. It even has a line where Friedrich tells Jo that ever since he started to fall for her, his students told him that he is much happier and smiles all the time. In the novel, it is the night before Jo is leaving. Friedrich gets his moment of clarity, like, oh my god, I'm so in love with this woman, what should I do? And the reason why Jo goes back home, it's not because they argue like in the films, it's because Beth gets ill, and Friedrich lost a sister. He knows what it is like. Jo does the same to Friedrich what he has done to her. She inspires him to take life by the balls. He starts to look for another job so he could provide both Jo and his nephews, and when Jo accepts his proposal and they begin to turn Plumfield into a school, Jo in a way returns him his previous status as a professor, and he simultaneously supports her career as a writer. This is how Jo tells her family about her plans. Now, my dear people, continued Jo earnestly, just understand that this isn't a new idea of mine, but a long-cherished plan. Before Mike Fritz came, I used to think how, when I'd made my fortune and no one needed me at home, I'd hire a big house and pick up some poor, forlorn little lads who hadn't any mothers and take care of them and make life jolly for them before it was too late. I see so many going to ruin for want of help at the right minute. I love so do anything for them. I seem to feel their wants and sympathize with their troubles, and oh, I should so like to be a mother to them. I told my plan to Fritz once, and he said it was just what he would like.
Hello, friends. It is Niina from the Little Woman podcast. Just to let you all know that the Little Woman podcast episode transcripts are now available as books. You can find them as paperbacks and ebooks. They are wonderful reading for all the fans of Louisa May Alcott. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
And agreed to try it when we got rich. Bless his dear heart, he's been doing it all his life, helping poor boys, not getting rich, that he'll never be. Money doesn't stay in his pocket long enough to lay up any. But now, thanks to my good old aunt, who loved me better than I ever deserved, I'm rich. At least I feel so, and we can live at Plumfield perfectly well. If we have a flourishing school, it's just a place for boys, the house is big, and the furniture strong and plain. There's plenty of room for dozens inside, and splendid grounds outside. They could help in the garden and orchard. Such work is healthy, isn't it, sir? Then Fritz could train and teach in his own way, and father will help him. I can feed and nurse and pet and scold them, and mother will be my standby. I've always longed for lots of boys, and never had enough. Now I can can fill the house full and revel in the little dears to my heart's content. Think what luxury, Plumfield my own, and wilderness of boys to enjoy with me. Philosopher Walter Emerson was Louisa's friend and neighbor. I will read you a quote from his book, Self-Reliancy. What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. This rule, equally arduous in actual and intellectual life, may serve for the whole in distinction between greatness and meanness. It is the harder, because you will always find those who think they know what is your duty better than you know it. It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the minds of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. What Waldo is saying that trusting your own instincts is always the best path to take, and it is also the more difficult one, because there are always people who try to convince you to go against what you know is right. Here is a quote from Louisa's early novel, Lady and the Woman, where she discusses on her ideas of marriage. Eligible Edward Windsor claims that the style of woman he most admires are those such as claim our protection and support, giving us in return affection and obedience, beautiful and tender creatures, submissive to our will, confident in our judgment, and lenient to our faults, to be cherished in sunshine and sheltered in storms. Kate Loring, a young woman of 24, with no pretensions to beauty, who has raised her 4 orphaned brothers, replies, "You have given your idol a heart, but no head. I would have her humble, though self-reliant, gentle, true strong, man's companion, not his plaything, able and willing to face storms, as well as sunshines, and share life's burdens as they come." Louise was part of the women's movement that developed into the first wave of feminism. One of the moving powers of this movement was to encourage people to marry for love instead of money. Most marriages of the time were made because of financial reasons. In Little Woman, Mommy says to the sisters that she would rather see them married to poor men and be happy than unhappily with rich men. Or the marriages in Little Woman, in one way or another, are wrapped around this idea that love is connected to self-reliancy. It is a very Christian idea of marriage, the idea that you build something better together with your significant other. I usually try to avoid politics and religion in all of my podcasts, but because Louisa May Alcott was a Christian and it had a big impact on her worldview, this is one of the things where I make an exception. When Louisa was in her early 20s, she considered marrying for money to help out her family. In Little Woman, this element is given to Amy, and a lot of people think that this makes Amy a social climber. I don't think that was Louisa's intention. The book Amy considers marrying Fred Vaughan because she wants to lift her family away from poverty. She's not thrilled about the idea. She sees it as her duty. Sometimes I wonder if the people who criticize Amy for marrying Laurie, who is rich but not as rich as Fred, but still wealthy, would they be as quick to criticize Jo if she had married Laurie? The cause of the whole argument is the lack of Laurie's character arc in the adaptations. In the 19th century, despite of the desire to work, women's work areas were limited. There was some factory work, but often women would work as maids or governess or tutors. Amy writes in her letters that if the artist career doesn't take off, one of the options is to come back home to Concord and work as an art teacher. Both Jo and Amy, they had very similar ideas about wanting to become wealthy for the wrong reasons. Marrying a rich man and to support your family that way. It seems almost too easy, but in the long run, that kind of thing could ruin your life. Jo thought that writing sensational stories would be easy money, and it almost cost her her mental health. Amy's moment of clarity comes when Laurie reminds her that she should not sacrifice her own happiness and that her family would not definitely support that kind of decision. And through this, Amy is reminded of her values and the way she was raised. I have talked bits about Laddie Wisniewski, who was one of the models for Laurie. Lisa met Laddie in Switzerland when she was working there. It is still a bit unclear why he was there in the first place. Maybe he was taking care of his health. According to Louisa, he had tuberculosis and she was nursing him. He was very flirtatious with Louisa. Then he allegedly proposed to Louisa's employee, Anna Weld, who did not react well, and Laddie was kicked out from the premises. Anna Weld was a very wealthy woman, which has led some Alcott scholars speculate that Ladislas was after her money. For the angry Laurie fans who are listening to this, I think the part of Laurie chasing Joe is what comes from this encounter with Lady Wisniewski, and rest of it probably comes from Goethe. About 10 years after the publication of Little Woman, Louisa's publisher had sent a check to Lady Wisniewski, and Louisa and Ladislas, they had not met each other after they had met in Europe. Why was Louisa giving him money? These are all theories. Ladislas had got married and he had children, and he needed the money to support them. Louisa loved kids, and she was happy to help. Second scenario, he was blackmailing money from Louisa, threatening to go to the press and tell about their time together in Europe. Laddie was 10-11 years younger than Louisa. That would have been quite a scandal. I don't know which scenario is the truth, but I do know that Louisa's sister May also knew Laddie, and they had actually lived in Paris at the same time. But May wasn't a huge fan of him, and it seems that Louisa got fed up with him as well. They describe him boring, and that he never pays his debt back. Money that Louisa gave him. Maybe May had also given him money that he never paid back. One of the biggest crimes that the adaptations do is that they make it seem that Amy and Joe are arguing over Laurie. In the book, Joe never wants him, and Amy doesn't want him either when he's being lazy and unproductive. In an article called Happy Woman, which Louisa wrote about a year after Little Woman was published, Louisa writes that accepting a false idea of love just because you are lonely is self-deceiving. Isn't this what happens in Little Woman? Joe considers Laurie's proposal because she is lonely. Perhaps the reason why Louisa rejected Lady Wisniewski was because she was still in love with Henry Thoreau. Henry, like all the transcendentalists, believed in self-reliancy. I think the best way to describe Henry's relationship with money is that he was a minimalist. He also came from a working class. His father had a pencil factory where Henry worked time to time. He was also a teacher and occasionally a gardener, a hunter, and a naturalist, and a writer. And of course, Henry was a transcendentalist philosopher like Friedrich. In Little Woman's saga, Henry is constantly present. Especially in Little Man, Louisa describes his love for simplicity when she writes about Friedrich's love for the natural world. In the 19th century, some religious parties considered the transcendentalist heretic because they almost had a pantheistic belief that nature was the most perfect expression of God. One of my observant book readers said that if Friedrich was based on someone who Louisa was in love with, that explains why she was frustrated by the fans who were demanding her to marry Joe to Laurie. Louisa never really liked Little Woman. She considered it as one of her worst novels. I think the observant book reader is right. Louisa wrote a lot about herself, and therefore success of Little Woman would create very conflicted feelings. Me and my friend Emily talked about this in our Laurie episode. In the 19th century, Laurie was a super popular character, and perhaps one part of that popularity was because he was wealthy. Every time when Louisa was asked about the real life Laurie, she would always speak very highly about Laddie to the public, but then in her private letters she was not so happy with him. So why is Friedrich poor? He is poor because he chose equal, and therefore they share their similar views on self-reliancy and can build their life together. This is what Louisa writes in the Umbrella chapter. Friedrich says, I could not find the heart to take you from that happy home until I could have a prospect of one to give you. After much time, perhaps, and hard work, how could I ask you to give up so much for a poor old fellow who has no fortune but little learning? I am glad you are poor. I couldn't bear a rich husband, said Joe decidedly, adding, in a softer tone, don't fear poverty. I've known it long enough to lose my dread and be happy working for those I love. And don't call yourself old. 40 is the prime of life. I couldn't help loving you if you were 70.